what we see here, what we will be taught here, is two stages of meditation. This first one is section 2, just to start in a minute, and the second phase of the meditation, perhaps I should say, is section 3. Why? Why are they in 2? Because, as we saw when we studied the theoretical presentation, what is to be understood, the direct introduction to our Buddha nature has to be approached, having dispelled wrong views. In other words, we have to use the common Madhyamaka teachings, to simplify this, we have to use the common Madhyamaka teachings to overcome any clinging that we might have to conditioned phenomena as real. Because if we haven't dissolved clinging to conditioned phenomena, most importantly, the notion of self, then when the Lama introduces us to the Buddha nature, we'll confuse the two. We'll simply think Buddha nature is like some real self, or kind of real soul, or real spirit, or God within me, or some such notion. And so to dissolve that, we have to meditate first according to the teachings of the second turning of the wheel, which of course are the sutras that are the source of the common Madhyamaka. So Control Lodro Thai describes this first phase of the meditation as settling in the unelaborated, non-conceptual state in accord with the intermediate wheel. The intermediate wheel, of course, is the second of the 3 turnings, in which one arrives at the profound true nature of reality. Unelaborated, in Tibetan Todral, means beyond all designations, beyond all intellectual positions and their linguistic designations. So, what is characteristic of all views, apart from the Madhyamaka view, is that it affirms either that there are certain things that are truly existent and others that are truly non-existent. It's kind of fixated on those two categories. Things are either truly existent or truly non-existent, truly nothingness, one might say. Even the Hinayana school and even the Chittamatra still finally will affirm there are some phenomena that are truly existent, that exist in themselves. But if phenomena truly exist in themselves, that's something for us to grasp at. And from grasping comes desire, hatred, and all the other disturbing emotions, from which come karma, from which comes suffering. So as long as there's grasping at the nature of things, having any categorizable characteristics, so which we can say, here it is, it's like this, it truly exists, or this truly doesn't exist, we are still going to be subject to clinging and grasping, and the rest of the samsaric process that follow from that. So we have to eliminate that clinging to elaborated views. So how to meditate? Well, Control Lodro Thai takes us through that. We've begun the session with refuge and bodhicitta. Then he says, sit in a comfortable position and cultivate devotion. Devotion means like faith in here, means faith towards the teachings. Now, if you've already realized the Madhyamaka view, the common Madhyamaka view, you've done extensive meditation on it, then it's all right. In a way, you can pass straight through to the next phase of the teaching, the phase in which you're introduced to and meditate on Buddha nature. But if you've not, then this is how you should practice, he will tell us. As he said, if on the other hand you have not accomplished hearing and reflection, you've not heard the teachings of Karmapa Madhyamaka, you've not reflected and meditated upon them, then meditate like this. Firstly, understand that your own mind is not established from any nature whatsoever, and in this way realize individual selflessness. What does he mean? What is this signifying? Well, in the Hinayana, the teachings from the first turn of the wheel, as we briefly mentioned yesterday, the way in which the ultimate nature of reality is understood is that there is an absence, an emptiness of the individual person, the I, to which of course I'm so strongly attached, the I which I identify with my body or mind, or in more detail, or one of my 5 aggregates. I identify it as with them, or if not, at least as some way an owner of those 5 aggregates. And due to that attachment to I comes a notion of other, from that comes a notion of desirable object or enemy, and then all the disturbing emotions proliferate. So the Hinayanists meditate to overcome that idea of personal self. And that's emptiness, because it is not actually found to exist. But from a Mahayana point of view, that is an insufficient understanding of emptiness. It's neither vast enough nor profound enough. Because for us in the Mahayana, following Buddha's teachings in the second and third turnings, it's not only that there is an absence of a personal I, in fact, there are no objects whatsoever, whether physical or mental, which can be said to truly exist, even momentarily. They all lack that characteristic of true existence or intrinsic nature. So, in our meditation now, we begin with the Hinayana perspective, because in a way it's more easy to identify the target. The target is, just as I've said, our notion that there's an I who is permanent, singular, and autonomous. Whether I designate it as my body or my thoughts or my emotions or my mind, I have such a notion. So first I look for that. Most likely I identified that I with my mind. But as Control Odotai says, understand that your own mind is not established from any nature whatsoever. The point is, if there was something truly existent, in this case, my mind as a self, one would be able to say how it arose. So one asks the question, in what way did that mind, myself, my mind, in what way did it come into being? Did it originate? And in fact, actually, when one considers that, there's only 4 possible answers one could offer for this truly existent my mind that I am convinced exists at this very moment now. The first answer is to say, it came from itself. But that's, in fact, totally contradictory to logic, because if a thing already exists, it has no need to recreate itself. Moreover, if the mind of this moment was generated by an identical mind in the moment before, same mind, my mind would reduplicate to eternity. If things came into being in this way, things from themselves, there'd be no change, no diversity. There would just be a replication of things forever. But that's clearly not the case. Everything is continuously changing. So the mind cannot have created itself. My mind, myself, cannot have created itself. But then I may consider, in that case, my mind was created by something distinct from itself, something other than itself. But actually, what could that be? Because if one thing, we'll call that B, is created by another distinct thing, we'll call that A, then anything could literally come from anything. Because the A and B, of course, are distinct. You say they're totally different entities. If one entity with these characteristics like that over there could create this entity over here with its own characteristics, really, truly, there would be total chaos. Anything could arise from anything at any time. Like Chandrakirti says in Madhyamakavatara, in this way, from flames could come darkness, whereas of course from flames always come light. In short, there is always a continuity, a connection between producer and produced. But if I say my mind came from something totally different than it, then I'm violating that logical principle. For instance, perhaps I might say, my mind did not exist, but then it came into being in dependence on some physical elements, perhaps the sperm and egg of these human beings. And so that would be an example of mind arising from something entirely different. Because sperm and egg are material substances devoid of mind, devoid of consciousness. They cannot give rise to that which is formless and endowed with consciousness, because they're totally opposite, totally distinct nature. Or perhaps you say you're created by some God, but God has one characteristic, if such a thing existed, it would be eternal and unchanging, and you're saying it created this mind, myself now, which is impermanent and continuously changing, and full of flaws, moreover. So whichever way I try to suggest mind comes from something other than itself, something distinct, it doesn't work. So then perhaps I say, well, it comes from a mixture of reason one and reason two. It's created partially by itself and partially by something else. But if you claim that, all you're doing is adding together two false theories, two mistaken theories. And two wrongs do not make a right, as we know, those of us who do not believe propaganda, we know that, of all kinds. So the third alternative is impossible. I said the fourth alternative, it comes about mind, myself, this moment, mine now, comes from something in without reason, just randomly. But nothing happens randomly in this world. If things happen randomly, flowers would materialize in the middle of space, but they never do. Because for flowers to materialize, there need to be the appropriate causing conditions. So option 4, random appearance of myself, my mind, myself, is not possible. So in fact, the very notion that I have this mind, which is myself, is impossible to sustain. Because if you can't find a way something that you claim exists came into being, then you have to give up asserting such a thing exists. So in this way, we let go of the erroneous notion that that the I truly exists. The I identified as permanent, autonomous, and singular. Of course, in everyday language, it's totally valid to say, to use the word I, for instance, to say, I will make that cup of tea for you. That's totally valid, as long as one doesn't assert there is a truly existent I there. But in terms of saying, I want to spare you the problem of making that tea, I'll do it for you, it's just good conventional truth, as well as being well-mannered, kind, and compassionate. So a proper use of the word I. The improper use of the word I is to believe there is such a kind of magical entity as the permanent self who's in control of its own experiences and never changes. So that is the analytical meditation to dispel belief in the I, the personal self. Now we're ready for the analytical meditation to dispel belief in the reality of both external phenomena and the internal perceiver. In other words, we're ready now to meditate on the deeper aspect of emptiness, not merely the aspect of emptiness signifying absence of personal self, but the absence of self or intrinsic nature, substantiality or solidity, whichever term you like, for any phenomena whatsoever. Because we may have seen through the fiction of an I, but we still, in a way, have many objects to cling to as being truly existent. And we cling to them for a sense of security, of validity, of solidity. So we will still assert there are still really existent phenomena that are the objects of my perception. And there is still a perceiver, the mind is still present. It may be continually changing, but the mind, my mind, the perceiver, still actually exists. Because that is the view of the Hinayanists. They asserted that while there's no objects which are permanent, they arise and pass away in themselves as validly existent momentarily. And while there is no self who's perceiving phenomena, there is a series of truly existent moments of consciousness which are irreducible and truly exist. That's a much more subtle view of things than the non-Buddhist view, which asserts there's just selves. But it still gives us something to cling to and is contradictory to the true nature of reality. So now we have to do that analysis to dispel such a view. Controller Duttai says, subsequently, he means after doing the meditation on the individual non-self, the non-self of the person, subsequently, by determining that the appearances of both all apparent objects and your own mind are not established as anything other than mere appearance, you will understand the selflessness of phenomena. So how to do this stage of the meditation? Well, actually, we talked about it yesterday, and yesterday I pointed out that if you're familiar with the meditation on ultimate bodhicitta in the Lojong, in the mind training, you're already familiar with this practice. Because there in the Lojong it says, meditate on the ultimate bodhicitta, the mind of the Buddha, so to speak, the enlightened mind, by both analytical meditation and settling meditation. So it's the same meditation in effect. And there it was taught, and so we apply this here, that firstly we must realize that all the objects that arise to my senses, which I label as truly existent, whether it be a visual form, a sound, a smell, or whatever, they're no more than the projection of my mind. They're just an aspect of mental experience. Because in that sense, they're no more real than imagery in dreams, as it indeed says in the Lojong teachings. Consider all phenomena like dreams. If one thinks about it a little, one will see, if that object was as I imagine it to be, that sound or that visual form, if it existed separate from my mind, validly in itself, as I imagine it to do, how would my mind have actually ever taken hold of it? Because such a view is implicitly assuming there's things out there, separate things existing in their own space, and then there's the mind here as some kind of agent of perception. Then between the two there's a gap. Things out there, mind in in here. And that'd be like one mountain over there, one mountain over here. They cannot touch, they cannot contact each other. Moreover, the nature of the so-called object, I imagine, is physical, material, but the nature of the perceiver, the perceiving consciousness, is formless. How can formless mix with that which has form? It cannot take hold of it. So the meeting between the so-called objects and the so-called perceiver is impossible. Rather, I should understand that just as the imagery in dream, though it seems very vivid and and evokes feelings, it is nonetheless just a aspect or activity of my mind, the play of mind. Moreover, one can establish that even more strongly by realizing that actually, for different beings, objects are perceived in radically different ways. As is said in the sutras, what humans see as water, gods will see as nectar, asuras will see as weapons, animals such as aquatic animals will see as their home, hungry ghosts will see as blood and pus, and the hell beings will see as the molten iron that they imagine is being poured down their throat. Each of those perceptions of objects arises in dependence upon the particular karmic imprints that gives rise to that type of being, to that realm of being. Therefore, it is correct, in a way, for gods to see nectar, or it is correct for us to see water. But in both cases, it is none other than the ripening of imprints. There's no truly existent object separate from the mind. Whether it's even the tiniest of atoms, which one might say physical objects are made of, we cannot arrive at any irreducible particle. Because for there to be particles that group together to appear to the the eye as something perceivable, they themselves, those so-called irreducible particles, have to have dimension to be able to be agglomerated with others, to add up to something perceptible. And if they have mass, they have internal dimensions. And as they can be further reduced. And that process of reducing so-called irreducible phenomena goes on ad infinitum. There's no end to it, except an arbitrary line I might draw when I realize that even the atoms that I imagine the world is made of are disappearing when I actually look for them, which is the truth. They're not actually really there. They too are finally a mental construction. So all the objects that I feel are real, even if I'm subtle enough to understand they're impermanent, they're more than impermanent, they're none other than mental projections. So with that, a whole kind of portion of my clinging to things dissolves. But still, I may cling to the idea, but the perceiver is real. There's no real objects out there, but this consciousness that is the basis of their appearing, that is real. But Control said, no, your own mind also is not established as anything other than mere appearance. And how? Well, again, we looked at this briefly yesterday. At this point in the analysis, you turn inwards as if you're in a cinema and you realize that everything that's on the screen is coming from the projector at the back of the hall. And now you look to see, well, is the projector actually there? If your mind existed, even as just a momentary entity, perceiver, where is it? It would be findable. It would have characteristics by which you can designate it and say, it exists in this space, it exists with this form and this color, and exists in this particular time. But whichever of these categories you run your examination through, you do not find anything truly existent. If one asserts, for instance, the mind is arising now, then where is it? Is it inside the body, or is it outside the body, or is it in between? One cannot find it, as we discussed briefly yesterday. One cannot find it in any of those places. So it's a thing without a location, which is impossible, of course. Or what color does it have? If this mind is an entity, perhaps we can designate it, its characteristics, saying it's this particular color. But we cannot find any color to the mind. Perhaps if we could find it has a shape. All entities must have a shape. They must have a certain extension in space, whether it's a circular, square, triangular, whatever. But mind doesn't have any of these. I can't find it having any of these characteristics of a truly existent object. And as for the mind of the past, we've already seen we cannot find a place where the mind arises, where it comes from. And now we've seen that we cannot say it exists now because we cannot find a location. Perhaps we might say it exists in this present moment. But what is the present moment? If the present moment, if there was something such as a present moment findable, it would appear as a moment in a sequence, following after a previous present moment. But then there'd be the gap between when the previous moment ceases and then where the new one begins. The new one begins, it endures momentarily and then passes away. But each of those three phases in the so-called present moment mind is further reducible. There's the beginning of the beginning phase. There's the duration of the middle phase. There's the end of the middle phase. And so on ad infinitum. In other words, one can chop up the notion of present moment ad infinitum. So to say, I do have a mind because it exists at this very moment is also unsustainable. And if the mind cannot be found to have arisen from the past, cannot be found to exist now, to talk about the mind ceasing is also impossible. What does not come into being cannot cease. So the three categories of arising, duration, and cessation cannot be applied to this so-called mind. So in short, wherever I've searched, and whichever way I've searched for the mind, I cannot find it. In this way, there's no objects and there's no subjects, and that is the totality of phenomena. There are either objects or subjects, but there's nothing findable there when I search. The relationship between mind and its objects is, as Contra says, in such a way mind appears in water. In other words, the waves are nothing other than the water. Through the waves, the water takes certain shapes momentarily, but they're none other than the water. Similarly, objects seem to arise like waves stirred up by the imprints in mind, but they're nothing more than the mind. And the mind itself is also not a truly existent entity. So he says, when through this analysis, because this is the analytical phase of the meditation, you've developed the understanding that subject and object are of equal taste. Equal taste means they're both none other than emptiness. They cannot be found, isolated as truly existent. Then he says, do not waver. So this is the instruction now for the settling part of the meditation, which is where, having used concepts to destroy concepts, so to speak, we now just let go completely so that we take the meditation into a kind of deeper, more experiential, less conceptual dimension. When you have developed this understanding that subject and object of equal taste, do not waver towards the outer. It means don't try to take hold of so-called phenomena. Not restricted in any way. It has no borders or edge, no center, no periphery. It has no bias, no preference. It's not colored in any way. It's not any kind of object. And therefore it allows the clouds, the stars, the planets, the solar system, in short, totality of all phenomena, arise and pass away within the sky, without the sky being in the least disturbed, biased in any way. And this is the attitude we should settle in, the kind of perspective we should settle in once we've dissolved this clinging to outer and inner, the objects and the subjects, sky-like openness. In a way, it's like no meditation, because you're not trying to produce anything now. You're not even trying to deconstruct or negate. The negating phase of the practice is over. You've done that through analysis. So now you can let go, completely carefree, so to speak, in your practice. As Kondro Lodro Thai says, at this point in your practice, whatever appearances of the senses arise are just emptiness itself, whether it's a visual form, whether it's a sound, whether it's a tangible, whatever it is. Previously you clung to it thinking this is truly existent, it has these characteristics and I like it or I don't like it or I'm bored by it, whatever. But now, because no sooner as it arises, you understand it's nothing other than emptiness, just like the wave is nothing other than the ocean, then you have no emotional reaction to it, for or against. So, because it's empty of intrinsic nature, empty of substantiality. So, as he says, therefore there is nothing to abandon or to accept. There's no objects that you should think, this is inherently bad, so I reject it, I try to block it. No any appearances that are inherently good, therefore I must grab and kind of try to preserve. There's nothing to hope for, nor to fear. You're not trying to get any result from the practice now, nor is there anything that can hold you back. There's nothing to block, as he says, or to establish. There's no so if many thoughts arise in your practice, previously you'd have thought, oh, I need to eliminate them by using such and such a remedy of shamatha, something like this. But no matter what number of thoughts arises in a session, they're no more than emptiness. So what is there to block? You cannot block, neither do you need to block emptiness. But neither are there any good meditation experiences to try to cultivate. In the sky, there's no good or bad. There's just the complete primordial purity of space. Similarly with your mind now in the practice, you don't need to try to create good meditation experiences like stillness and so on, rather than thoughts. Neither is preferable, because all are just empty. Therefore, as he says, when movement occurs, meaning like the arising of thoughts, the succession of sense experiences, whatever it is, which you would previously have thought of as disturbing your meditation, because as an initial meditator you think it's necessary to develop stillness to overcome thoughts by producing as much stillness as possible, by the mind being as unmoving as possible. But when you realize that that which moves, the waves, the thoughts, the senses, sensory experiences, are never departing from emptiness, they're never other than emptiness, then what is there to fear about movement? So that dualism of thinking, in my meditation there's stillness, the gap between thoughts, and I should have more of that, and thoughts, the movement, I should have less of that, that's totally mistaken, totally irrelevant. Whenever movement occurs in your practice, just maintain their self-pacification and self-liberation without fabricating anything at all. It means, just as the wave, when the wave arises from the ocean, does anything need to be done to it? No, not at all. It never stopped being the ocean. It never stopped being water. The wave simply manifests and then subsides into the ocean, because it never became separate from the ocean, never became of any different characteristic. So it's like, one might say, the ocean never needed to do anything to the waves. They pacify themselves. As they arise, they're already peaceful. They already liberate and disentangle themselves because they're no other than the ocean. So it is with thoughts and emotions or sensory experiences in the practice. As dualistic meditators, we think of them as an obstacle. We try to block them and try to create good meditation, proper experience, what we think of as good meditation experience. But that is a trap. As a great Dzogchen master Jigme Lingpa says, you can be chained by a golden chain just as much as a rusty iron chain. Golden chain meaning the idea of having good experiences in meditation and trying to increase them. So no matter whether in your meditation you have few thoughts or many thoughts, when you reach this state, this way of practicing, you don't discriminate because all thoughts, all experiences pacify themselves, liberate themselves as they arise. So in short, Control says about this method, following the second turning of the wheel, you search for mind and determine that it is realize, confirm, something like this, and determine that it is primordially unelaborated and self-liberated. Whatever arises liberates itself in accord with the stages of examining the settled mind set out in the textual guides. Apart from this single recognition of the unelaborated true nature, there is nothing to meditate upon. We think, I must calm my mind down by meditating on this object or meditating on the breath, or even when we practice so-called vipassana, we think, I need to investigate and do this and analyze things. But that's still, in a way, insufficient understanding, still a kind of limited understanding. It's useful for beginners, but when we've practiced properly through the stages, we realize finally there's nothing to do. There's no kind of technique necessary. Because he says, once you recognize the unelaborated true nature by giving up clinging to objects and mind, that's it. There's no object of meditation any longer. Where could you put your mind? You can't. You cannot put your mind on sky. You can't put your mind on the space. It has no kind of ledges within it, no kind of spots you can fixate on. So simply rely upon being mindful of the unelaborated. This is what is taught as uncontrived nowness. Is a very special technical term used in the Kajupa text, uncontrived nowness, or the natural state of whatever arises. Now, actually the fact that Control Lord Thaye is using these terms, which are actually part of the Mahamudra terminology, shows that for him, this way of meditating is already analogous to the Mahamudra system. As he says, without clinging to one's mind, which is just luminous and empty, without clinging to one's mind as a self, in other words, one's mind which is naturally luminous, devoid of subject and object, and empty at the same time, whether happiness or stillness, whether happiness or sadness arise, whether stillness or movement arise, simply maintain without fabrication. Fabrication means artificial techniques, such as trying to produce more stillness, produce more wisdom, whatever it is. Don't use techniques. Get rid of that. Just rest in the nowness and the natural state of whatever arises. Not nowness as an object that you can grasp and say, this is the present moment, but just to allow your mind to be totally without any preference, any positioning whatsoever, just one with whatever arises. That is the method, which is in a way no method. Do not be bound by that which is to be abandoned or striving for an antidote, because that is, again, just dualistic meditation, which obscures this free nature of mind, this unelaborated nature of mind. Resting in this non-meditation of unsupported awareness, through this the ultimate shamatha and vipassana of Mahayana arises. As he calls it, non-meditation. It's not a technique any longer. And unsupported awareness means you don't fix your awareness upon anything as you do in other forms of meditation. You're not even fixing your mind on emptiness as something to be discovered. You let go even of that, because an emptiness that you can meditate on is not the primordial emptiness. It's at best merely a correct intellectual concept, a mental object, but not the real primordial emptiness, the natural emptiness which cannot be designated in any way. Even the term emptiness is still an intellectual designation which depends upon the concept of non-emptiness. So it can't be the real nature, if that is the case, if it's still a dependently arising term. At this point, whatever impressions of meditative experience or qualities of the path might occur for you, the profound point is to recognize one's own nature without desire or attachment. In other words, you might, when you're practicing in this way, yes, certain nyam, certain experiences like perhaps bliss or clarity or non-conceptualization might arise, or even some qualities of the paths, like the path of accumulation and application, they may arise, but don't grasp at them, don't fixate on them, because that would be in a way to try to establish some territory, some possessions. And with that, you obscure the actual free nature of mind, the unelaborated, simple, primordial nature of mind, which is beyond all levels, all paths, all designations. So that is the essence of the meditation, the first half of the main meditation, meditating according to the second turning of the wheel. With that, then, we're ready for the introduction to the Buddha nature. As Contra Lodra Thai says, when some degree of shamatha and vipassana have developed in this way, through this analytical and then settling meditation on the unelaborated, then the introduction that makes the correct distinctions between the existent and non-existent, and which is in accord with the final wheel, the third wheel, and the Vajrayana, can be made. So there's quite a lot to unpack there, but just as simply as possible, one might say, he's reminding us that now we're going to go beyond reasoning and technique completely, to be introduced to the natural presence of the Buddha nature, which is in a sense is not an object of hearing or thinking or even ordinary meditation, because it's been our primordial nature since beginningless time. So how can it be categorized in any way, shape or form? It cannot. But to be in a place to receive that introduction properly, so that one can really identify and settle in the Buddha nature mind, the true nature of one's mind, you need to have gone through these preceding stages, so that you're, as it were, completely without bias, completely without clinging. And he's further said, this teaching is not only in accord with the sutras of the third turn of the wheel, the Buddha nature sutras, but he says it's in accord with the Vajrayana. As if one could say, there's a view to Vajrayana, then one might say, it is none other than this view. This is Contra Lodra Thai's position, the position of Shentong teachers, that their view is, that their teaching is exactly what was taught in the Tantras, not only taught in the third turn of the wheel sutras, but taught in the Tantras. So Contra says about this, if one has For this, if one already has some general understanding of the sutras on the Buddha nature and the commentarial traditions, like Maitreya's 5 Dharmas, or most importantly, the 5th one of those, the Supreme Continuity, that would be sufficient, actually, as an introduction. They would work for you to introduce you to the Buddha nature, because your mind is already well prepared. Or perhaps you can receive from your master the transmission of Dolpopa's famous text called Richu Neden Jamso in Tibetan, the Mountain Dharma, which is an ocean of certainty. So the way it's presented there would be enough for you. But as he says, through these you'll understand that the essence of mind is natural emptiness endowed with all supreme characteristics. Natural emptiness endowed with all supreme characteristics means the way mind is empty is not a bare emptiness. Like, for instance, when one says the table is empty of intrinsic nature, one means that there's actually finally no table there whatsoever. The mere appearance is arising through dependent origination of different causes and conditions. But if one were to look into it, one would not find any table. It's empty of itself, naturally empty of intrinsic nature. This is bare emptiness, as you might call it. But the way the mind is empty is, as we'll see, explained in great detail, not that. It's empty of anything conditioned, so therefore it's not a self, it is not identified with moments of consciousness or the body or anything like that. It's empty of those conditioned phenomena, but it's not a non-existence. The table, its lack of existence, is a non-existence, a non-affirming negation. There's nothing left when we actually analyze the table. But with the true nature of the mind, that is not such an emptiness, because the mind has these Buddha qualities of wisdom, compassion, power, and so on and so forth. So the mind is an affirming negation emptiness. Means, yes, it's empty of conditioned phenomena, but not empty of its own qualities, its own pure nature. So we call that emptiness the emptiness endowed with all supreme characteristics, to distinguish it from bare emptiness. And this is referred to by many names in different scriptures. So it can be called the clear light or luminosity, Wesel in Tibetan. It can be called Buddha nature, as in fact it is called in the sutras of the 3rd turn of the wheel. It can be called Tatata, which means thusness, meaning the precise nature of reality. Or it can be called Mahamudri. Interestingly, it's a linguistic point, but in the Tibetan text, Jampa Control uses the term Chajachemmo, which is a feminine ending, and for the Great Seal. Usually we use a masculine ending, Chajachempo. In Sanskrit, that would be Mahamudra. But here he uses the feminine ending, Mahamudri. It can be either, of course. It literally, it means the Great Seal. In the Tantra, the Great Seal is the consort through whom you realize the primordial wisdom, and the supreme of all consorts is the Mahamudra itself, realized at the end of the path. So it can be male, it can be characterized by male or female designation. It doesn't matter. Or this true nature of mind can be called aham. Aham, the Sanskrit term aham, means I. But specifically when we find this term in the Tantras, referring to what in the sutras is called Buddha nature, it symbolizes that Buddhahood arises through the unification of the red female element and the white male element. Ah, female, ham, male. So all these are different ways this same true nature of mind, which we generally call the Buddha nature, is referred to. It's the same point. as he said, all these, there's many different terms to it, but they're all unaffected by the fault of contradiction. They're not contradictory. So, by relying upon these teachings, Control says, you'll understand the definitive and ultimate teachings of the Buddha and actually experience primordial wisdom in your own meditation. In this way, you realize that all conditioned phenomena are simply imaginary. They're like as imaginary as the dreams that arise in the mind. And that is how they're empty. But the Buddha nature, the mind, is not empty in that way. It is to be introduced as unceasing, luminous awareness. Buddha nature, the self-arising primordial wisdom. So, Buddha nature is empty of the conditioned phenomena. They're just like clouds, just as the sky is empty of the clouds. They do not stain it in any way. They do not obstruct it or limit it. But the sky is not negated when we negate the clouds. Similarly, the mind, the Buddha nature, is not negated when we negate the conditioned phenomena. So this is what you should meditate upon in this system. So we went a little bit further last year. Yes, he reminds us that at the beginning of the session, we meditate on refuge and bodhicitta. So he wants to discuss a little bit about the nature of the three jewels, as we've already talked about, as being, in fact, just the manifestation of the Buddha nature. He says, in this way, one should always recollect the ultimate three jewels. And the ultimate three jewels they're the manifestation of the Buddha nature. And then he wants to, in terms of the philosophical systems, wants to point out that the Chittamatra is valid to overcome certain things, like clinging to outer objects, but it doesn't go far enough. Then you need the Madhyamaka, the ordinary Madhyamaka, to dispel clinging altogether to objects and subject as being real. But then you need the Buddha nature teachings to overcome the clinging to emptiness that will result if you go no further than the common Madhyamaka. And then Kontrā Rinpoche introduces what are called in the Jude Ornament and the Jude Lama, the three reasons through which we can understand that all beings possess the Buddha nature. So this is a way of introducing the Buddha nature, so to speak, or pointing out the Buddha nature. As he says, just as not a single one of the four elements is not pervaded by space, earth, water, fire, and air, all pervaded by space, so there is no object of cognition that is not pervaded by the Buddha's Dharmakaya. Those of you who study jewel ornament will remember this in chapter 1, the causal basis, that the point being is that as everything is pervaded by emptiness, nothing goes beyond emptiness, then, and as the Dharmakaya, the true mode of a Buddha, is emptiness, is none other than emptiness. If we are pervaded by emptiness, we're pervaded by the Dharmakaya. And so therefore, even now, what we are fundamentally is Dharmakaya. But it's hidden from us, so we call it Buddha nature. But nevertheless, the Dharmakaya exists in us. That is the first ground for confidence that we possess the Buddha nature. Secondly, as he says, concerning the reality of Buddhas and the reality of sentient beings, right now we dualistically take them as very different. Buddhas have one quality, one characteristic, we have another. But the actual reality of everything is one and the same. There can be no gradations in ultimate reality. The ultimate reality of a sentient being, the ultimate reality of a Buddha, is indistinguishable. So, therefore, as that's the case, even though we seem to be sentient beings, and Buddhas seem to be Buddhas, There is no truly good, bad, great, small, superior, or difference, or inferior. So we have the same possibility of producing the Buddha, of manifesting the Buddha qualities as Buddhas. We just don't know that. So that is because there's no distinction or differentiation in the reality of Buddhas and sentient beings. And thirdly, the third reason is that we all, the inclination to realize Buddhahood, to realize the true nature of reality, exists in all sentient beings. We all belong to, as it were, ultimately to the lineage, the family of Buddha. But temporarily, that appears in 5 different degrees, so to speak, from the cut-off family, who are most remote from realizing their Buddha nature, to the Buddhas, to those who belong to the Mahayana family, who are closest to realizing it. But all sentient beings have the inclination to realize Buddhahood, and this will sooner or later manifest. So these are the 3 grounds for confidence in the Buddha nature: that all beings are pervaded by the Dhammakaya, that there's no distinction in the reality of Buddhas and sentient beings, and that all of us possess the inclination, or as it's called, the family of the Buddhas. So that is where we've reached last year. And so from now we have several pages in which Jamgon Kongtrul will introduce us in different ways to the Buddha nature, so that we can take it into our meditation. And most of these are drawn from the Supreme Continuity. So let's continue with that. I think the day after tomorrow, I don't think we meet tomorrow. We have 4 sessions. I'm confident as one can be, that we will complete the text in those 4 sessions. But it was necessary, I think, to bring us up to date with the first half of the teaching. So there's a minute, maybe, if anybody's got a question, as long as it's not too complicated. I will strive, despite jet lag, to answer it.
Yeah, thank you for your teachings. The topic of Shentong deeply touches the topics both of evolution and of like artificial intelligence, if the possible of creating consciousness artificially.
So, no, it's not. No.
In a way, it does for me. So,
sorry. I should have listened to the whole question.
Can I just finish, please? So I'm coming back to your 4 steps of the 4 analytical steps, like if consciousness is created, is it possible that consciousness is created? So the second one, I have arguments against your arguments, and I would be.
It's not my argument, it's Lord Buddha's argument.
Yeah, sure.
I'm not clever enough to have arguments.
Sure. And I would be happy if you help me to contradict my arguments. So you said that if the second one, that it's fabricated from 2 parts, would be true, I hope I quote you right, then it would be possible that something creates also the opposite. And you brought as an example that darkness can be created by light. Am I right so far?
Yes, this is what Chandrakirti says.
Yes, so what Chandrakirti said.
Yes.
So in my daily life, I don't know if it's possible to create darkness from light, but it's definitely possible to create silence from sound. So I would say this is contradicted.
I don't know anything about that, about sound and silence. But the thing is that this is Chandrakirti's analogy. Perhaps some scientists might say different to Chandrakirti. But for us, the idea that which is not endowed with sentience can suddenly manifest, it can, through some kind of jiggery-pokery, with material non-conscious elements can suddenly create consciousness is as absurd as the Christian idea that an omnipotent, infinite, unchanging God suddenly said, "Let there be light." We regard that as a similar argument for something coming from something entirely different. For us, it's the same as voodoo.
Lama Jampa, thank you for your clear teaching. I have two questions. So one question is, during the second stage of meditation, first you negate the existence of an individual mind. And then in the second stage, you negate the existence of phenomena based on that individual mind. Now, there's a step here between those two negations, on which I need some advice, because these can be taken in two ways. First, you can say, because individual mind is non-existent, of course, all the phenomena that arise from it should also not be existent. Or you can take it completely the other way and say, yeah, but I still experience these phenomena, so then I also must have an individual mind. Can you advise on how to reflect on this?
I'm not completely hearing everything you're saying, but so I'm just going to give a kind of approximate answer, which is that you could, in fact, as is done in the Lojong, you could go straight to the second meditation, which is to establish outer objects arising as part of mental experience, and then look inwards to the mind, which you imagined would be a valid source for that, and see that's not existent. But here he wants to kind of, as it were, align the meditation session with the philosophical schools. So first of all, he wants to follow the Hinayana demolition of a merely personal I, which you would identify with either with one of the five or more of the five skandhas, and then look at the dualistic framework, which is the Mahayana meditation. And so the mind that you're looking at there in the second phase of that, having demolished external appearances as true objects, is like a much more subtle version of the mind that you'll still be working with if you're Chittamatrin. Because there the Chittamatrin thinks, yes, I'm not a self, I'm not the same as my body, there's no, the five skandhas are not autonomous in any way, they're not permanent, so they can't be a self. But they say, but the mind, which is, as it were, the basis of the dream, which imagines itself in the dream to be both to be the one experiencing the objects, but on waking realizes there was no experiencer and no objects, there was just the dream arising in mind. There's still a clinging to that mind which is the basis of the dream as something truly existent. And that is what is being demolished in the second phase of this meditation on appearances and then mind. So it's a much more subtle take on the mind than the Hinayana take. It's the Chittamatrin take on the mind, which is a non-dual, momentary, truly existent consciousness. So he's presented this way to go through first the Hinayana, then the Chittamatra, and then from that into the Madhyamaka.
Thank you. And then for my second question, do you recommend these reflections, these meditations, if you've not finished your preliminary practices?
Sorry, I didn't. It's incredibly difficult up here to hear, by the way.
I should talk louder, sorry. Would you recommend reflecting this way, meditate this way, if you've not finished your preliminary practices, your Nandro?
This is it is a different system from the Mahamudra Nundro, I mean, I would say if somebody's practicing Mahamudra Nundro, please continue with that and please finish it. And if you're not practicing Mahamudra Nundro and you're drawn to this, then you don't need to have done the Mahamudra Nundro or any Vajrayana Nundro for this.
Thank you.
Well, I think the bell has reminded us of impermanence, so let's answer its call and finish with dedication of merit. Sunam di tanshi zikpa ne tobe ne pi dranam pamche ne chiga nachi bala drupayi sipe sole drowa sho.
Dear friends, and small announcement, we are still looking for some volunteers who would like to help us serve the land.